8 more hostages as well as 30 more Palestinian prisoners have been released as Israel-Hamas truce extended for a 7th day.
International pressure is mounting, demanding a further extension of the delicate ceasefire deal, which is now set to expire in hours. And a total of 8 Israeli hostages have been released by Hamas in the latest exchange, which includes 6 adults, a 17-year-old girl and an 18-year-old man. And these include dual nationals of Uruguay, Mexico and Russia.
2 women hostages were released first and the release of 6 other hostages followed hours later. All were handed over to the Red Cross in Gaza and have been taken to hospitals. Now, these are the emotional scenes that unfolded at the time of the exchange. This is 21-year-old Mia Shem, who was abducted from a music festival on the 7th of October. She had a tearful reunion with her mother and brother, who arrived at the Israeli airbase where the exchange took place.
Several Israelis gathered to welcome the release of new batch of hostages, and they could be seen waving Israeli flags and cheering as the convoy carrying hostages as it passed in front of them.
באנו היום להביע תמיכה ושמחה בחטופים שלנו שחוזרים הביתה ולהגיד לאדון ביבי שאנחנו פה ודואגים שהוא יחסל את החמאס.
Well, these are the visuals of the bus carrying the 30 released prisoners heading to Ramallah in West Bank.
But the scenes of jubilation here were hampered as clashes occurred between Israeli soldiers and Palestinians. Israeli security forces fired tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse Palestinians gathered to welcome prisoners released. Israel has said that it will not allow festivities for the released prisoners in parts of the West Bank that it controls.
As the deadline for the latest extension of truce is nearing an end, questions now remain whether the deal will continue. Calls for a further extension are of course growing all over the world, and as per reports, Hamas is willing to further extend the truce and mediators are making intense efforts in this regard. However, the statements come from Israel at this point indicate that attack on Gaza could begin any moment.
במהלך הלילה התעקשנו על מימוש המתווה הנוכחי להשבת הנשים והילדים, וכך נעשה גם למחר. המתווכים, קטר ומצרים, מחויבים גם הם למימוש ההסכם כדי שההפוגה תימשך. צה"ל מוכן להמשך המלחמה. אנחנו ערוכים להתקפה בכל שעה, גם הלילה, גם מחר, אנחנו ערוכים להתקפה בכל שעה.
U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who is currently on his 3rd West Asia visit since the war began, has called for Gaza truce extension to 8th day and beyond. But he urged Israel to create safe zones for Palestinian civilians in Gaza before Israel resumes major military operations, that's quote-unquote, in the Hamas-ruled territory.
In my meetings today with the Prime Minister and senior Israeli officials, I made clear that before Israel resumes major military operations, it must put in place humanitarian civilian protection plans that minimize further casualties of innocent Palestinians. That means taking more effective steps to protect the lives of civilians, including by clearly and precisely designating areas and places in southern and central Gaza where they can be safe and out of the line of fire. It means avoiding further significant displacement of civilians inside of Gaza.
Yemen's Houthi rebels have threatened to escalate their attacks against Israel if the ceasefire ends, and Iran-backed rebel group has launched at least 6 aerial attacks against Israel since the war broke, while Houthi rebels seized an Israeli-linked cargo ship in a crucial Red Sea shipping route on November 19th.
إن القوات المسلحة اليمنية تؤكد على ما يلي: استعدادها الكامل لاستئناف عملياتها العسكرية ضد العدو الإسرائيلي في حال قرر استئناف عدوانه على غزة. إن القوات المسلحة اليمنية لن تتردد في توسيع عملياتها العسكرية ضد الكيان الإسرائيلي لتشمل أهدافا لا يتوقعها في البر أو البحر. إن القوات المسلحة اليمنية مستمرة في منع السفن الإسرائيلية في البحر الأحمر، وسوف تتخذ المزيد من الإجراءات لضمان التنفيذ الكامل لهذا القرار.
U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken visited Israel and West Bank. What does it mean for Israel and the United States as well as the West Bank? Our correspondent Susan Tehrani from New York tells us more.
As America's top diplomat was in Tel Aviv, U.S. President Joe Biden spoke on the phone with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, allegedly insisting that the way Israeli operations were carried out in north of Gaza cannot continue in the southern part of the region. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken also visited the West Bank and met with a Palestinian Authority leader, Mahmoud Abbas, raising speculations that the two discussed what happens next after the Israel-Hamas war. It was important for Prime Minister Netanyahu to make clear to President Biden that Israel is doing everything it can to prevent civilian casualties, despite the challenges its military faces in an urban battlefield. Was he successful in doing so? Well, we may soon find out. Ultimately, the way the cards are stacked right now, the United States and Israel's interests in this war are intertwined. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World as well.
All right, to discuss matters further, we are now being joined by Jonathan Wachtel, who is the former Director of Communications and Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. Welcome to the broadcast, Mr. Wachtel.
Pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you here on World DNA. Sir, it started off with a 4-day truce, then a 2-day extension, and the last minute there was a 1-day extension. What are we heading towards here going forward?
Well, the fact that it's extended as long as it has is kind of remarkable given the intensity of fighting that we had seen before. The basic fact, though, is that, there are only so many hostages to trade in with these Palestinian prisoners in exchanges. It's a finite, this is like an hourglass running out every time. So eventually a decision has to be taken, presumably by both sides and then the other parties involved, as to what they really want to do. And the Israelis have made it abundantly clear that after October 7th, it was gloves off and they really have to take out Hamas. And Hamas has made it abundantly clear that they are going to continue to try to strike at Israeli civilians and continue the carnage given the opportunity. They've been firing rockets, not as much, obviously, given what's happened. But, they're in a position also to continue with the fight. So, the big question here is if the Israelis desire, which is stated, to eliminate Hamas's ability to kill civilians and to kidnap people, then they're going to resume here. But the problem, as your reporter just outlined, it's an urban setting. Hamas is hiding within the civilian population, using them as shields, and in some cases even keeping them from actually leaving the danger in the fight and subjecting them to the full assault of the Israeli military when they go after the Hamas fighters. So it's a terrible situation. But then again, how do the Israelis approach this? If they're being given directions that they can't take out Hamas to the full extent that they're trying to do, that means they have one arm tied behind their back, which makes the going all the more difficult for them and may prolong the conflict. Who knows? This has been a very bloody conflict by nature of the setting and by nature of a non-state actor who is now actually the state actor, if you were to call it like that, the governing force within the Gaza Strip, that is completely different from the governing body that's in the West Bank. And who is representing the Palestinian people in this fight? And Israel is at war with that entity, with that Hamas entity, not against the Palestinian people per se. So very complicated situation.
Definitely.
And Mr. Wachtel, on the backdrop of the extension of the truce that has been extended twice already, 105 hostages have been freed by Hamas, and there are still fewer Israeli women and children who are in Hamas's captivity, and even soldiers for that matter. Do you think there are going to be any new terms of release that we can expect in the future?
This is for the Israeli men and soldiers, of course, once the women and children are exchanged.
Yeah, I mean, we have the precedent of Gilead Shalit, which, there was a massively disproportionate exchange of people for people, one person actually for so many Palestinian prisoners who were released. And, from the Israeli perspective, some of those Palestinian prisoners who were released, including the Hamas leader within the Gaza Strip, who's orchestrated this attack on October 7th and is still managing things in the Gaza Strip. There's a very painful pill for the Israeli population, certainly, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who authorized that exchange when it happened. So, it is a very, very delicate situation. This can go any way. As we saw today, it was a much smaller number of exchanges that happened, and the proportionality remains questionable, and whether there is a stomach for Hamas even to give up its bargaining chip of these soldiers at this point. They may find it more prudent to hold on to them for a while because they have that particular leverage over the Israeli psyche. And giving them up too soon then enables the Israelis to say, okay, now it's gloves off and let's go at Hamas full scale. It may be a strategic decision to try to prolong things and allow a trickle of soldiers to be released in exchange for these Palestinian prisoners.
Yes.
Hamas really has leverage here to hurt the Israeli psyche, and it's doing it to maximum effect.
Mr. Waschel, I just want to take that leverage point of yours, and you had mentioned something earlier in your first response as well, that, there are only so many hostages that Hamas has left. My question was, and if we're of course speculating and analyzing right now, how long do you feel Hamas will be able to continue the pause? What happens after all Hamas-held hostages are released?
Well, one thing that was a very telltale thing is the terrorist attack in Jerusalem today, in which Hamas claimed that they were their militants, attacked civilians at a bus stop in Jerusalem and killed several and wounded others and terrorized the civilian population in Israel. So the appetite for allowing an indefinite, prolonged, well, it is definite in terms of finite number of hostages held, but this prolonged process in which the Israeli population still feels that they're under assault and threatened physically. I mean, literally, people were killed today outside of the actual conflict that we've been witnessing over the last weeks. So I could not possibly expect the Israeli public nor the government to tolerate that type of activity on top of everything else. That at one point they may decide, you know what, this exchange, and though we love our soldiers so much and we want them to come home, we're at a war here against an implacable enemy, and that needs to be the primary focus because they're killing Israelis outside of even this conflict itself, the Gaza, Lower Israel battle that we saw and the rocket exchange, but the battle which is concentrated on the Gaza Strip by the Israeli military to take them out of power.
Mr. Waschel, of course, deaths have happened on both the sides. Nearly 15,000 Gazans have also lost their lives. So here's hoping that there is peace which resumes at the earliest and which is long-lasting. Thank you so much for joining in on the broadcast, sir. That was Mr. Jonathan Waschel joining us from New York.
Bye-bye.